Okay, so why don't we kick things off? Hello, welcome to our webinar called Hot Set. We're here today to talk about extreme heat and wildfire risks in the motion picture industry, just in case you're not necessarily in the right place. That's what we're talking about today. My name is Marcia Newberry, and I'm the Vice President of Sustainability and Business Affairs at Thunderbird Entertainment, and also the founder and executive director of Producing for the Planet. And I'm going to be your MC today. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am privileged to work and live in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia and on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Kwantlen, Katzie, Matsqui, and Semiahmoo nations. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So our webinar today, we're aiming for about 45 minutes. We have about 30 minutes or thereabouts of remarks from our speakers, and also we're leaving some room for discussion and questions. If you have a question as we go, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. After each speaker has gone, we will address any questions that come up, but also we can come back to them at the end and have discussions. When we do get to the end, you can also raise your hand and we can take sort of verbal questions if you like. This webinar is being recorded. A recording will be available within 24 hours on the CMPA website, and a link will be sent out. And of course, we welcome you to send the link to anyone in your network that you think would benefit from any of the information that we're going to share today. So we are thrilled to bring you a fantastic group of speakers today. Levi Kimball is a partner and senior industrial hygienist at Aura Health and Safety. Levi is a certified industrial hygienist with 15 years of experience working in the field of industrial hygiene, primarily as a consultant. Levi has spent time working in various industries such as film and television, mining, construction, manufacturing, food processing, and energy. So he is an expert in identifying, managing, and monitoring a wide variety of exposure hazards. Dagan Nish is a safety advisor with Actsafe Safety Association. He has 14 years of experience in the motion picture industry, an acting background, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in emergency and security management, and is certified as a workplace psychological health and safety advisor. He has led health and safety departments as an OHS consultant for several episodic series and an independent feature film. And finally, we have Warren Carr, who is a motion picture industry veteran with experience in producing and production management on productions of all sizes, types, genres, locations, and budgets, and has extensive experience in thinking about sustainability on film sets and on-the-ground experience. And Warren is also a member of the DGC BC's Climate Action Committee. Now, before I hand the microphone over to our speakers, I want to set the stage a little bit for our discussion today. So our goal today is to give you an understanding of the regulatory requirements for employers when it comes to risks from extreme heat or smoke events, to understand how to identify and mitigate those risks, and also to leave you with some best practices and tools and an understanding of how to go about creating an exposure control plan for your productions. Now, the reason we even need a session like this is that events like extreme heat and wildfire smoke are becoming more common and more intense due to climate change. These are not long tail events any longer. Here's a staggering statistic I came across just this morning from BBC News. Today, Thursday, June 20th, about 1 in 5 Americans, more than 70 million people, are currently under extreme heat warnings and excessive temperatures. The heat dome that is impacting Eastern Canada right now, I believe it's peaking today in Ontario and Quebec, in fact, has brought dangerously hot and humid conditions impacting millions of Canadians. And extreme heat can be deadly. 30,000 people died in the 2003 European heat wave. The Western heat dome in 2021 was the deadliest weather event in Canada to date, where temperatures were up to 20 degrees above normal. And in BC alone, 619 people died in that 3-day period. Well, what about wildfires? So 2023 was a record-setting year in Canada for wildfires, with all provinces and territories impacted. The 2023 wildfire season had the most area burned in our recorded history. So climate change is here, and climate risks are business risks, they are production risks. Events like extreme heat are not only deadly, they're also costly. In our industry, we work outdoors, and most productions don't have the luxury of being in safe, air-conditioned spaces. So these are risks that have the potential to shut down a production and significantly impact the health and safety of workers. On that happy note, I will hand the microphone over to our first speaker today, Levi Kimball.
Thanks, Marcia. Let's get into my presenter view here. Okay, there we go. Okay, thanks everyone. So my name is Levi Kimball, and I'm an industrial hygienist. Just a really brief background on industrial hygiene, because not everyone knows what an industrial hygienist is. So we essentially we deal with exposure hazards within the health and safety industry, and we look to recognize, evaluate, and control these hazards. So it's kind of a very a niche part within the health safety industry. We don't clean teeth. So the film industry is basically a microcosm of heavier industries. There are a lot of different exposure hazards within the film industry. I started working in the film industry in 2016, and if you had have asked me before that, like, is there a lot to do for an industrial hygienist in the television and film industry? I probably would have said no. Like that's not the image I had in my mind, just from my knowledge of TV and film. But there's a wide range of exposure hazards. Things with special effects such as atmospheric fog, set construction, painting, rigging, costumes. So all kinds of different aspects of the industry can have exposure hazards associated with them. The two we're going to talk about today, more environmental, that being heat stress and wildfire smoke. So Marcia gave a really good prelude to this, just kind of going over, a lot of those like kind of staggering statistics on, increased temperatures, temperature extremes, and increased forest fires. I posted just a little clip here. This is from, I think, a couple days ago in Ontario. So yeah, kind of a little bit ironic that that's going on right now in the eastern part of Canada. But these events are just getting more and more frequent, and they're happening all the time. Okay, so I don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to go fairly quickly at kind of a high level. If anyone has more specific questions, happy to answer them after. But I will be going through this fairly quickly. I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the health risks, like why do we care about these hazards? Some of the regulatory aspects, a little bit into jurisdictional differences, and then one of the main things I want to go over today is some of the aspects of assessment and some tools that we've developed that can help with assessment, and then some of the considerations for hazard management. Okay, so just jump into heat stress. So the human body is designed to operate at 37 degrees Celsius, with plus or minus about half a degree. If your body starts to elevate above these temperatures, then it's going to do things to try to lower it back down to that ideal temperature window. Things like this can result in some disorders like heat cramps, rash, dehydration, and you can kind of go all the way down the list to heat stroke, which is the most serious, and that can result in loss of consciousness, cognitive impairment, and it can even result in death if it's not treated right away. So a really wide range of possible symptoms and disorders that are associated with heat stress. So that's really why we're kind of why do we care about it? Okay, so a little bit into the jurisdictional comparisons. So just due to the audience, I'm going to focus on WorkSafe BC and a little bit in Ontario. But I just want people to know that there are differences in any jurisdiction you're in. So you really want to know where you're working and look into it to know, your responsibilities and obligations within that specific jurisdiction. So within BC, we do have a part of our regulations that are specifically speaking to thermal exposure. I believe in Ontario, it more falls under the general duty clause. And so that's a little bit of a difference where it's a little more prescriptive in BC, and Ontario kind of defaults to guidelines. So it's not regulation. There's a bunch of different monitoring methods. The given jurisdiction can dictate which ones they deem to be acceptable. There's actually quite a few that are allowed to be used in BC. Ontario does also make reference to some of the same ones in their guidelines. So again, important to know where you're working and what methods are acceptable to the regulator there, before you would hop in and start doing an assessment. I also wanted to speak to trigger points because this is important for productions, because these are kind of, like limits and levels, temperatures that you need to know about, because they can impact your production and kind of what your obligations are. So 23 degrees Celsius in BC, that's where you need to start considering heat stress as an exposure risk of note, and essentially do an assessment. So that is an important temperature to note. Once you get above 29 degrees Celsius on the humidex, this is important because essentially your exposure control planning needs to kick in here. You need to start doing measurements on site at a minimum every hour, and posting these. So that's a relevant temperature to note. And then often, what people really want to know is kind of like, what's a go, no go? Like, at what point is it not safe, or are we unable to really do our job and operate the production? And so when you're using the Humidex model in BC, 38 degrees on the Humidex is quite notable, because that's when a work rest regimen kicks in. And so, you are allowed to work beyond that point, but it would be quite difficult, because you can only work so long, and then people have to sit and rest in a cool area. So that is a notable trigger. In Ontario, there are different ways that different trigger points. The most notable, easiest to remember is if the temperature is 30 degrees Celsius with a humidex of 40, then that triggers the need for a hot weather plan, which is, kind of like a simplified exposure control plan. So that's just a little bit of a summary, kind of BC and Ontario. Okay, so heat stress assessment. So I already discussed, there's lots of different ways to go about doing this. A lot of them are quite technical, and difficult to do. This table here shows you values from Humidex. There are other ways. You can actually measure internal body temperature. I think everyone would agree with me that the HR departments probably wouldn't want to go about that route here. So we don't want to be measuring everybody's temperature. So that leads me into a tool that was developed by IATSE. And so this is essentially a way that we think simplifies doing the heat stress assessment, and it's an app on the phone that uses the Humidex model. So main points about using this tool. So in BC, it states in the regulation that you need to do measurement like at the site. So you need to have a means to take temperature and humidity values, like physically where the production is located. That's not too big of a deal, because you can basically get instruments that do that for $20 at your local hardware or drugstore, such as a hygrometer. So these aren't expensive instruments, but you do need to do that on site. As I mentioned, so the app does work off the Humidex model, which was developed in Ontario, and it's a nice simplified way to assess heat exposure it's based on kind of how you should feel. So how the human body should feel with certain temperature, humidity, and some other aspects, such as the clothing they're wearing, work rate, and anticipated radiant heat. So the app would ask some questions. It doesn't take very long, 5 minutes or less to fill these things in. And then it would essentially spit out a risk level and some recommended controls. So it's a nice tool that people can use to do a risk assessment for their heat stress. And this does meet regulatory criteria in BC for heat stress screening purposes. Again, you'd want to check what jurisdiction you're in. Everywhere is different, but in BC, this would be a compliant means to do that. Okay, so switching gears to wildfire smoke. So sorry for how busy this slide is. Main takeaway is this: I want people to know that there's a lot of different chemicals within wildfire smoke. So it's not just one thing. There's gases, there's vapors, there's different kinds of particulate. So it's really complex, and it can change depending on what type of materials burning. Different types of trees and different types of foliage would emit a different type of smoke. And just the fact that a lot of these things are very, very small. So this photo here just gives a diagram relative to a human hair. And so a lot of the smoke particles fall into the range of PM 2.5, so 2.5 micron in diameter. And as you can see, that's extremely small, like much smaller than a human hair. So a lot of these things, when they're inhaled, they can get down way deep into the lungs where they can do damage. So they're very, very small, which also allows them to travel far distances as well when there's a lot of it. Okay, so why is it a problem? So from a health perspective, wildfire smoke exposure can cause a wide range of respiratory issues. It's got cardiovascular risks. Some of these components are human carcinogens, so increased cancer risk. So it's nasty stuff. You really don't want to be inhaling this if you can avoid it. And there's little to no regulation in Canada from an occupational standpoint. So there is more public health guidance on this, but in terms of workplace regulation, which does differ from those intended for the general public, there's really not much out there right now at the moment. So just to give people a little bit of an idea of what's out there from other jurisdictions. So I did talk about the fact that in BC and Canada, we do have public health guidance. So in BC, we've got what's called an air quality health index. It's got a rating scale from 1 to 10, and it considers ozone, PM 2.5, PM 10, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. So those are all the different parameters that would go into that determination on the scale. There's other ones that are similar. The air quality index is in the US. It's got a different scale, but it considers the same contaminants. Down in the States, they actually do have some jurisdictions with workplace regulatory guidance for wildfire smoke. Cal OSHA has some, Oregon, and then in Washington, they also have some. Take home here is that I just want people to note that so PM 2.5 is kind of the common denominator here for all the contaminants, and so it is typically seen as the best marker for wildfire smoke. So there's a bunch of different things within wildfire smoke, but PM 2.5 is typically used as like the best marker to measure so that you can tell, how bad is this wildfire smoke? Well, we're going to measure 2.5 and we're going to use it to estimate all those chemicals that can be associated with the smoke. And then I did want to point out again, we kind of talked about trigger points for heat exposure. I did want to point here. So, a kind of go no go for the film industry. I think everyone would agree is probably the point at which a respirator is mandatory. We saw during COVID, it's really hard to film and do television and film when people are mandatory in respirators. And so in some of the models, a lot of them actually, when the AQI hits 500 or more, that's where it kind of triggers respirator use. So that could probably be seen as kind of like a go no go. Okay, so in terms of assessment for the wildfire smoke, so IATSE also has an app for that. Uh, it is based off the Washington rules, so it's using the workplace guidance that's from down in Washington State, which is obviously very close in proximity to BC, and we kind of saw it as the best practice guidelines to use for work in British Columbia. So that is what the app is based off of. Again, so it uses PM 2.5 concentrations at the user location. The nice thing about the Wildfire Smoke app relative to the Heat Stress app is that if you don't have a means to measure the smoke concentration on set, then you can actually use geolocation. So you can use the same data that your weather app has on your iPhone or your Android or whatever device you have, and you can just use that, and it will estimate your wildfire smoke exposure without measuring. Now, if you do have the means to measure it on site, then you can also input that as well. So you have some options there. And then again, you enter a few parameters, it takes less than 5 minutes, and then it will produce an exposure risk level and some recommended controls. I will mention that, it's intended for wildfire smoke use. You can get PM 2.5 in the air from other sources. So really it should only be used if there is, known wildfire smoke in the area. If you just take this to some, polluted city like Beijing or something and use it, it's going to spit out a result because there's probably a bunch of PM 2.5 in the air, but, it's really only intended to be used for wildfire smoke situations. Yeah, and so I just really want to thank both IATSE 891 and Actsafe. So IATSE funded these apps, and both were instrumental in the development of it and working with us to put those apps together. So I'd like to thank both those organizations very much. In particular, Mitch Davies, the IATSE president, Madeline Norman, and Mr. Don Ward. And then from our team, I'd like to thank Mona Shum, Karen Toak, and Adrian Fung. Yeah, so anyways, thank you, everyone. I'll pass it off to Dagan now from Actsafe, and he's going to speak a little bit more into the specifics of the actual exposure control planning, that you could use, along with the risk assessment from the tools that I've discussed here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Levi. That's fantastic. So I will also be, brief in reviewing what I have in a very high level, just for lack of time. So the two resources that I want to focus on today, of course, are exposure control plan template for extreme heat. So this is a resource that is designed to align and meet the regulatory requirements of WorkSafe BC, including their regulations for exposure control plans in general, as well as their guidelines specific to heat stress assessments. It's very much like comprehensive in a step-by-step process for users to be able to design with a reliable framework, their policies and their procedures. So their plans as well as their step-by-step actions to carry out those plans in the event of an incident. It details planning components, including defined responsibilities from the employer, the supervisors, the workers themselves. It is also aligned with the Humidex monitoring methods. It describes a various number of risk controls that you could utilize, training requirements to consider, as well as procedural components like incident reporting, incident investigation, etc. The nice thing about it as well is that it is a template Word doc with key components highlighted in yellow for the users to be able to edit and revise. So it can be very much just filled in to meet your needs and kind of be tailor fit to your organization's specific context. Now, moving on, we then have our newly updated safety bulletin for preventing heat-related illness. So this is also, of course, fit to WorkSafe BC's OHS regulations for thermal exposure. And it's really, a call sheet memo or safety bulletin designed to be general safety information for the benefit of the general workforce on the day. Of course, it still can be a reliable resource to use in tandem with the development of your exposure control plan. But really, if nothing else, it's going to be a distilled amount of information to help crew, performers, everyone on site to really understand, how to recognize maybe their own signs of symptoms for potential heat stress, when and how to discuss this or notify their first aid departments, and also how to take advantage of the control measures that they would likely be provided when they were on a production site. This is, again, one that has been newly updated, so it might be familiar to you from the past iteration, but if you have not seen our new version, I definitely encourage you to check that out. And then some other resources that I just want to note are our exposure emergency response plan template. So this is a framework designed to help employers design emergency response planning, not just for extreme weather events, but also for medical events, fire. And there is a component of it designed specifically for considerations around business continuity and business recovery. So much to Marcia's initial point of like, these events can quite literally bring a production down. And so thinking not just in terms of the medical aspects, but also the business function aspects and how to plan in order to keep that production running. It includes a planning table with the number of hazards to be considered and some samples of tools or approaches to take from the mitigation phase to the preparedness phase to the response phase. And it also has a convenient emergency contact form that you can fill out and disseminate throughout your production. We've then got an emergency preparedness info sheet, which is a somewhat distilled version of the same resource, the emergency response plan. It can be very much used in tandem with the planning and then for the implementation. So disseminating that information for the benefit of the managers and the supervisors who might have responsibilities to activate those plans in the event of an emergency. And it also gives some very succinct procedures, step-by-step kind of bullet points to follow in the events of fires, earthquakes, chemical spills, extreme weather events such as extreme heat, floods, etc. And it also has at the very end 2 checklists for essential items in office emergency kits as well as personal emergency kits. Next, we have Hot and Smoky, which is a webinar that we hosted last year with Mona Shum of Aura Health and Safety. It's a fantastic presentation. It is running about 90 minutes, but it gives you a very insightful overview of how to develop your exposure control plan specific for motion picture productions, and helping audiences understand how they can best leverage occupational and public health guidelines for the development of those plans. And then last but not least, I'm excited to announce that we do have a new wildfire smoke safety bulletin that is on the verge of being published. This has been newly minted and we're just in the final stages of getting it approved by our governance board, but all the signs indicate that it is going to be hot off the press by the end of this month. And it includes distilled information regarding the health risks and industry tailored control measures to consider as part of your planning. It is designed again with WorkSafe BC and the Air Quality Health Index of BC's kind of framework in mind, but it could certainly be transferable in many ways conveniently for stakeholders in Ontario or elsewhere in Canada. And it also links readers to relevant resources such as BC Centre of Disease Control and BC Air Quality advisories. And that's all I have for you. If there aren't any questions, then I'll pass it on to Warren.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you, everyone, for organizing this and for CMPA to being the point person on this. All the information that's come out from Dagan and from Levi is all the best information we could possibly get our hands on in essentially an unregulated area. But that being said, I sit here as a representative of the DGC, as a production manager and line producer, and we are the employer. And the employer ultimately is responsible for worker safety. And as PMs, this kind of situation that is accelerating as the years go by puts us in a position of having to step up to the plate and say, we can't work today. So it's all about planning, it's about collaboration, and it's about education. And as every show starts up, we usually have a big meeting where we go through all the normal things about harassment and that sort of stuff. Soon we're going to see issues about climate change and sustainability. And as the seasons change, we have to get into briefings about work conditions. And that's where we also rely on the crew, because there's a lot of people that will run around and say, I'm okay, I'm fine. But, and how do we plan for a heat event? I think it's important that when you see one coming, it's not tomorrow. You're planning a week back at least. And you're including things like cooling tents, misting, extra first aid people, extra liquid on set, and the ability to know how to treat, because you could have cases of heat exhaustion in 7 different places on your set. And you may not have all the first aid people to do that. So an info sheet that's very simple for a worker to carry on and know, so that when someone's got heat exhaustion or heat stroke, things that you do and don't do. For example, in if heat stroke people, you don't give them liquid to drink. It's a hazard. It can cause an edema. And it's very hazardous. So those kinds of points are very important to educate our crews, every time we're in a heat-related situation. All the other stuff is kind of easy. When it's snowing too hard or there's too much ice, we just can't work. And it's too windy, we can't work. But in some cases, this heat application to the crew, to many, is invisible. And that's where we all have to be collaborative, and we have to look at one another, we have to look after one another, and we have to pay attention to what's going on. Other than that, I don't have really much else to say other than to underline that as the employer, it's up to us to step up to the plate and look after our crew and apply these guidelines when we're working. So I'll turn it back to you, Marcia, and I guess we're going to move on to questions. But that's it for me.
Well, thank you, everyone. We do have one question, and if I invite everyone, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand. So we have a question from Melissa. This is about regulations. So does anyone here know where she would go to find what the regulations are in Newfoundland?
That's I would have to look. I probably find it fairly quickly, but yeah, I'm not familiar off the top of my head with the Newfoundland regulation, and yeah, I could certainly look into that and get back to her if that's possible.
Yep.
And yeah, and if they don't have anything specific, then again, like Ontario, it would fall to that general duty clause. And there's still stuff that you would be obligated to do as just as a best practice, even if it's not specifically written in the regulation like it is in BC. So yeah, I'd be happy to have a look.
Great, Melissa. We'll send you that information after the webinar. Some questions that came in from the registrations. Are there any unique considerations, or would you change any of your recommendations for a production that is working with minors? Like, are they vulnerable in different ways or not?
They are so that there's no specific workplace regulations for minors for multiple reasons. We do run into this in other hazards such as like atmospheric fog and some of those other exposures. There is public health guidance relative to children, and so I would probably recommend using some of that material like within your exposure control planning. And I mean, they certainly are more susceptible than healthy adults, but there's nothing prescriptive in regulation, and so it would kind of default to best practices and using some of that public health guidance to possibly make different rules and a little bit more robust in your exposure control planning for having minors on set.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Can the speakers talk about how heat stress can affect workers' mental health?
Well, it definitely we touched on it a little earlier, but dizziness, nausea, headaches, confusion, are all and in terms of heat stroke, losing consciousness, heat exhaustion, same sort of symptoms. Dizziness and headaches are the big one, and fainting. So those are the parts that can be pretty easily detected. And I believe you touched on, Levi, you touched on certain aspects of that in our preamble about people being affected, or was it Dagan, about the statistics of people who were suffering from heat exhaustion that had mental issues and how that exacerbated that. Was that you, Dagan, that was going to tell you?
Dagan.
Yeah, I was we were just discussing kind of the comorbidities that we can see really come up with incident rates of fatality and like extreme acute medical emergencies around heat stress, and surprisingly, pre-existing conditions like heart disease, kidney disease, diabetes. These are ones that we kind of know and are already aware of from data of the past, but now we're seeing a lot of data indicating those with pre-existing mental health conditions can be at an extremely high risk, and that wasn't previously known from data. We also, for the work that I did with our extreme heat safety bulletin, I was part of the technical advisory team that updated that, and we found that there was a lot of data that suggested, increases in anxiety, mood disturbances, reduced patience and tolerance, or decreased coping capabilities. So it can really be disruptive, not only for the person's individual experience, but also for the collaborative approach that is necessary for a production to really excel. And so it can create a lot of inter-conflict between workers and between departments, as well as reduce people's cognitive functions from like memory loss or inability to problem solve things as much as they're usually capable of. So yeah, the impacts can be widespread, both for physical health and mental health.
And can you unpack for us, how does that intersect with employer responsibilities? So if someone is, going through cognitive impairment because of heat stress or other issues, what's the employer's responsibility there?
Yeah, great question. So, there's definitely the duty to care and the duty to accommodate. That's kind of a general through line. But for BC specifically, we do have regulations around physical and mental impairment, which this would fall under. So it's the regulation particular around physical and mental impairment is a two-hander that outlines the responsibilities of the workers themselves, as well as the supervisors and employers above them. So a worker, if they recognize that they are experiencing mental impairment, cognitive impairment, be it from extreme heat or some other factor, they're legally responsible to notify their supervisor and to say that due to the effects of, the condition, the extreme heat, I'm no longer fit to do the work I'm being asked to do without it creating an undue hazard to myself or others. And then it's up to the supervisor or the manager to decide what can be done, whether we can, accommodate and adjust the work, or if we have to reevaluate the task itself. But then the two-hander to that is the employer and supervisors. They're mandatory, they're obligated to not delegate tasks to workers if there are observable or reported signs of impairment. And that's a little bit tricky if you're not informed, because a worker might not necessarily come up to you and say, hey, I'm impaired, I can't work right now, but they might describe symptoms that are indicative of impairment for someone who knows what they're looking for. And so supervisors and employers, if they're found later down the road, say, an incident occurs where a worker was subject to impairment, cognitive impairment from heat stress, and they end up having an accident, say, involving mobile equipment, and they are later found in the investigation to have reported those symptoms to their supervisors, employers, and told to just get back to work, then that can be really a really significant problem from the regulator standpoint. And so there is definitely some through line for responsibilities around managing impairment and not delegating tasks if you have reason to believe that their cognitive functions are no longer fit to be able to do the work they're usually expected to do in a safe way.
You've actually touched on something that is quite apparent to me in my career, and with a lot of people that are new in my job and are trying to, for want of a better term, make a name for themselves, bring their show on, on schedule and on budget, and that, go rest in the tent and go back to work, you'll be fine attitude has to go. And I, in this particular situation here in Canada, let alone North America, where more than 50% of the workforce are unemployed and have been unemployed for a long time, going back to work and then suddenly having to say, I can't work because I'm not feeling well. And when they're looking at their first paycheck in 7 months, it's a very interesting place to be in terms of safety and HR when you're walking up to a worker on your set to say, you have to take a break or you have to go home. And documenting that and having the support of your first aid people and HR with you all the way through is important. And picking up the phone and speaking to all the people, because many of us, particularly in the West here, work for American studios where, you know, you're working down in California, God, where they're working in deserts all the time and all that stuff. And, you know, I mean, have an employer turn around over the phone and say, can't be that bad. We work in a desert down here. So it's confronting that kind of political and safety politics, both at the upper management, middle management, and worker level, is delicate, but it has to be handled. And we also have to be aware that we may have to increase staff and increase the schedule to cope with these weather issues. And that requires the production people to stand up, to come to the plate and say, this is unsafe. We need to delay or we need to work a shorter day to get the work done. And there's consequences. Sure, there's probably consequences with budget and schedule, but it's the worker and everybody's health and mental health that's the most important of all.
Well, I'm going to let Warren have that wonderful last word because we are at time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, particularly our speakers and all of you who came today. Remember, a link will be sent out, and please share that with people in your network. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.